Good day, everyone. Good day, good night, good morning, wherever you are. My name is Gordon Tapper. I'm the former Chief of Section at the United Nations, founder of an NGO, Give Them a Hand Foundation, now Chairman of the United African Congress, which, together with the International Association of Applied Psychology and the Black Star News, we are the ones who are hosting this event today. Now, let me welcome the viewers and listeners from all around the world for our guest today on this important webinar on the topic of the coronavirus in Africa. And when I say around the world, I mean around the world. We have guests from Argentina, from Vietnam, from Stellenbosch in South Africa, in Kenya, in Ghana, in China, and a number of different places. And I wish to welcome you. Today, we will not so much be talking about the disease itself, the coronavirus. We will be talking more about the fallout of the disease. We know that it has impacted perhaps every aspect of our lives and what we would consider to be normal. Physical distancing means that many millions of people around the world are isolated from their family and fellow workers. They're home trying to keep safe, not earning a living, and in many cases, having to choose between starving and preserving the lives of themselves and their families. There are many different areas we could focus on, but today we will be focusing on racism, discrimination, xenophobia, and human rights abuses that the pandemic has engendered in foreign lands as far as Africans are concerned. As you all know, the virus has now infected more than 3.2 million persons around the world, with over 228,000 dead. Africa, with a population of 1.3 billion people, has around 30,000 infections and less than 1,500 deaths. Africa must be doing something right. And we should be considering that. The people have floated reasons why this may be happening, but I think in our next webinar, or one of our next webinars, we will be exploring that. It's a remarkable result from a country that is considered as being weak with medical or health infrastructure. We note also that Senegal has been testing everyone, and their test kits cost just $1. So there is something happening that we ought to take a look at. But for today, we're focusing on the racism, the discrimination, the xenophobia, and the abuses of human rights that our people are being subjected to. And before I exit the stage, I wish to inform you, the participants out there, that you may submit questions and you want to ask of the speakers and panelists. And you may submit your questions in the chat box. Certainly we won't be able to get to all of them, but we will try as much as time permits. Today, we have a lineup of very qualified and experienced speakers. First up is Dr. Arikana Kwai, former ambassador to the African Union Mission of the African Union Mission to the United States. She's originally from Zimbabwe. She's also a medical doctor herself. One of Ambassador Arikana's greatest achievement as ambassador is mobilizing and engaging with the diaspora here in the United States and getting it to work more for the development of Africa. She's an avowed Pan-Africanist who has been and continues to fight for a better Africa. Next in the list, we have Ms. Yaqui Wang, a researcher with Human Rights Watch. She's from China and will speak on recent developments in Guangzhou. Our third speaker is Ms. Isabella Alexander-Nathani. She's a professor at Emory College, a human rights activist, a filmmaker, an author, and an award-winning writer. Her mission is to lift the voices of marginalized populations to the global stage and to fight for international policy changes. She has the distinction of traveling with African migrants traversing the Mediterranean in rickety on unsafe boats to reach the European shores. She will tell you more about that, I believe. Lastly, we have Mr. Richard Towle, who is the Deputy Director of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in New York City, UN headquarters. He has been with UNHCR for more than 25 years. He has served in Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, and the South Pacific. He will speak on the challenge of the coronavirus in the refugees camps and in other areas. We also have other standing panel members of experts, namely Dr. Mohammed Nurhussein, Chairman of the United African Congress, Professor of Medicine Emeritus and former Chief of Geriatrics at State University of New York, Downstate Medical Center. Dr. Judy Kuriansky, United Nations Representatives of the International Association of Applied Psychology, Professor in the Department of Clinical Psychology at Columbia University Teachers College, Trustee of United African Congress, and psychosocial first responder and trainer in many infectious diseases, epidemics, and natural disasters. We have Mr. Milton Allimadi, a Ugandan by birth, adjunct professor of African history at John Jay College, a Pan-Africanist, a human rights activist, and publisher of the Black Star News. And lastly, we have Stephanie Evans, Director of Education and Associate Professor at the Harlem Hospital, New York City. She's the Director of Give Them a Hand Foundation. And before I stop the introduction, I want to remind you that you can submit your questions in the chat box. But now it's time to turn the stage over to a real fighter. And the first person I will call on is Ambassador Arikana. Ambassador Arikana, are you here?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. We're happy to have you.
Thank you.
Please proceed.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me on your platform, and to everyone else who are the panelists. It's nice meeting you over this Zoom call, and thank you for all the work you're doing to promote our Africa. This Zoom call is about human rights abuses of Black people. This is a very important subject that I think we as Black people must really come together and let the world know once and for all that as Black people, we can no longer continue to be the most disrespected race on earth. We are the original people. We are the race that is responsible for humanity. I often say to Black women, we must wake up every morning and pat ourselves in the back and say, without a Black woman, there would not be humanity as we know it. It is a Black woman who gave birth to the first human being. For that reason, we must stand on top of the tallest mountain and proclaim to the world who we are, the proud and beautiful Black people. But what amazes me and disappoints me greatly and gives me sleepless nights is the realities that we're dealing with as Black people. I often say, it's almost as if there was a memo that went around the globe, letting others who are not Black, that if you encounter Black people, you have the right to abuse them, no matter where you are. Because the same sentiment prevails no matter where you see Black people around the globe. So what is happening in China is not different from what has been happening to Black people around the globe. China becomes even more interesting in the sense that there's only 700,000, there are only 700,000 Africans, continental Africans and other Black people in China. And yet there are over 10 million Chinese on the continent of Africa. The Chinese in Africa are welcomed and received with open arms. In fact, they are taking contracts that belong to Black people. If only we could organize and take our place as far as the development of Africa is concerned. and yet our people cannot receive the same welcome. China has got to do better. While I understand that the majority of Chinese are good people, they're good citizens, however, the bad elements in their society, they have to be dealt with. They cannot abuse Black people just for the sake of abusing them. When you saw the memo that was put, the notice that was put at the door of a McDonald's, where Chinese people were being encouraged to notify the police if they see a Black person, and that Black people were not allowed. In this 21st century, that we can still have things like that going on, it is really sad. It is shameful for McDonald's to allow people like that to open franchises. It is unacceptable. And we as Black people, at what point are we going to wake up and say enough is enough? What is being done to us as Black people around the globe will not be tolerated by any other race. If we were to look at Africa, you look at China, that's beginning increasingly to look like the next colonizer. The other colonizers have never left. What I find interesting is the other colonizers would like to warn us about China, but they forget that they too have not left. So I equate to, if you got two thieves in your village, you got an old thief and a new thief. What platform is the old thief standing on to warn us, the villagers, about the new thief? What platform is France standing on to warn us about China coming to Africa? What we are asking as Africans is to say, our former colonizers, you have been exploiting us for far too long. Africa is a big continent. Africa is big enough to accommodate the entire world. You can put all of China into Africa, all of India into Africa, all of Europe into Africa, and we'll all be okay. So what is needed is for the world to realize that what Africa is asking for is what little girls and little boys in Europe want. That is what little girls and little boys in Africa also want. What little boys and little girls in China want, that is what little boys and little girls in Africa also want. The world must come to Africa with respect. The world must treat Africa fairly. That is all we are asking. And I don't know why the world has a problem with this, except that they feel entitled to treat us like we are subhumans. Well, let me say this. Those who set out to oppress us, we are not going to expect them to change the situation. Our circumstances can only be changed by us. Africa belongs to Black people. I often say, you don't go to China and make decisions about what is going on in China, about investing in China. A Black man can never go to China and bring a Chinaman to come and invest in China. A Black person can never lead a Mexican man to Mexico to go invest in Mexico. The same is true with an Indian, with anybody from Europe. Why is it then that we Black people, we are being taken to Africa by those who are not Africans? Why are we allowing this to continue? Well, I can tell you why. It's continuing because we were intentionally put to sleep. We were intentionally brainwashed. The legacy of slavery and the legacy of colonization remain alive and well within us. And until we wake up from our slumber and unite and let the world know in a resounding way that Black people around the world have woken up and that Black people are saying enough is enough, that we demand our respect and that we will not accept abuse of any kind in any way, shape, or form. So to President Xi Jinping of China, while we understand the majority of his citizens are good people, he needs to deal with the bad elements of his society. For we Black people are not going to be quiet until Black people in China are treated fairly, until Black people anywhere on earth are treated fairly. We are asking the world that they do what is right, what is just, what is fair in Africa and all people of African descent around the world. On my end, on a personal note, I will speak to these injustices as long as there's breath in my lungs. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Arikana. You speak with passion, a commitment to the Black cause, You remind me of the words of Marcus Garvey, "Up you mighty race." You remind me of Bob Marley's song, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None of them can free our mind. We have to do it ourselves. And thank you so very much for all you are doing, standing up for Africa. And we are aware of that letter that you wrote to President Xi. I hope he has responded. For you wrote it not to persecute him, but to have a dialogue as equals. And again, thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. And now the next speaker we will have is, her name is Yaqui Wang. She is Chinese. She's from Human Rights Watch. And she's going to be speaking about the same subject. Well, a little different. She's going to be speaking about the abuse of Africans in China, in particular over the last several weeks in Guangzhou province. Yaqui?
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much, Ambassador Arikana, for this passionate speech. So I'm going to just talk a little bit more in detail of what's happened, what's still going on in Guangzhou. I've been speaking with Africans who are currently in Guangzhou for the past 3 weeks. So the context is that, the virus started in China, but the Chinese government has instituted this draconian measures. So the situation was to an extent contained in China. Then there were people who came to China. They brought the virus that was still going on in other countries. So that is the context. The Chinese government wants to crack down on the virus that it brought abroad to China. First of all, the people who had virus from outside of China mostly are Chinese people who are living abroad. So they're going back to China. So they're not foreigners who brought the virus, mostly are Chinese. So interestingly, on April the 2nd, there's a report from the Xinhua news agency, which is the Chinese state media, alleged that a Nigerian man with COVID-19 attacked a Chinese nurse. And because the nurse tried to stop him from leaving the hospital, the isolation ward in the hospital. And so that news, that Nigerian man attacking a Chinese nurse, and there were pictures, got widely spread on Chinese social media. Then on April the 7th, the Guangzhou authorities said that 5 Nigerian men living in the city were tested positive for coronavirus. So that is the background, and there were a lot of anger towards, the Nigerian man, and to a large extent, Africans, for bringing the virus again to China. On April the 12th, Guangzhou authorities had announced that all foreigners in the province must accept COVID-19 prevention containment measures, including testing, sampling, and quarantine. As I said, the virus that brought from abroad, mostly by Chinese people who are going back to China. And secondly, this announcement totally disregard, whether the foreigner had travel history, had any contact with people who are known to be infected. And in practice, authorities in Guangzhou only targeted Africans for forced testing and quarantine. There's little evidence to show that other groups were subjected to this treatment. So we started to hear, this announcement was made on April the 12th. But even before that, I started to hear about Africans being taken away to hotels to be forced quarantined, to be taken to be forced tested around April the 7th and 8th. And there were a lot of reports from people on social media. They're posting their videos and images of themselves, Africans in Guangzhou, being turned away by hotels, restaurants, and shops. And we saw videos on Twitter about Africans because they have nowhere to go. They can't go back to their apartments because their landlord has told them, we are not going to rent an apartment to you again. please move out in an hour. And then those people moved out and then go to the hotel, and the hotel said, we can't take Africans. So in effect, those policies by the government rendered Africans homeless. So they had to sleep on the streets. So there are the videos on Twitter that of Africans having all their belongings next to them and sleeping on the streets. I talked to people who had this experience, people who told me that a guy who the authorities came to his apartment on April the 9th at night, saying that you have to go to the hotel to be quarantined. And he was with his wife is Chinese, and the authority just told his wife, you can stay at home, just stay at home for 7 days. The African guy, you have to go to the hotel for 14 days. First of all, they have to pay for their own hotel room. So it's about 300 RMB. It's about $50 a night. And they have to pay for their own food, for their own beverage. And this guy I spoke to, during 14 days he was in the hotel, he was tested twice and it was negative. After he was released after 14 days, the authority again asked him to test twice. Again, he was negative, and he had to go through this forced quarantine, had to pay everything, had to go back to be repeatedly tested. He is one case. There's another case. I talked to an African. He's from Cameroon. He said he was told by the authorities to be quarantined at home for 14 days, and there was a surveillance camera outside of his door. If he leave the door, the governor would be noticed that he left home. He told me it's okay. If everybody is to be tested, just, we're trying to save life, we're trying to contain the pandemic. But why is this only happening to Africans? Why we are being targeted? Then there are other cases of people telling me of, themselves being refused by the subway. There was a person, he's Canadian, of African descent. He said, he was taken by the police to the police station, and they found out he's Canadian. He was let go, but next day he wanted to take the subway, and then the subway workers told him that, you're African, so you can't take the subway. And he said, why? And then they said, this is just the orders from above. So he was not able to take the subway. He could not go to shops. He could not go to restaurants. He was turned away, everywhere for 2 weeks. So this was, the images everywhere on Twitter, and there was a lot of anger towards that. I think when I saw African leaders spoke up, including Ambassador Arikana, I saw your video on Twitter. The Ghana, I think it's Ghana's. I think it's the leader of the parliament summoned the Chinese ambassador, and we saw the videos. I was happy to see the African leaders actually taking a stance to defend Africans in China. However, the Chinese government responded by deny that discriminations against Africa in Guangzhou exist. And they just restated the thing that they've been saying all the time, saying, we reject differential treatment, we have zero tolerance for discrimination. And that was the statement by the foreign minister, the spokesperson. Then the Chinese state media start to run stories to refute criticism that the Chinese authorities had mistreated African nationals. And they start to blame Western media for provoking the problems between China and African countries. So this thing is continued going on. I still start to see videos and of people posting about the unfair treatment, and still people saying, we've been turned away by shops and restaurants, and the Chinese people on the street, when they see us, they would turn away, and sometimes they would even, do this. So I think, my conversation with Africans in China is that they really want African governments, their leaders in Africa, to put pressure on the Chinese government to take a strong stance that, you are representing us. You should speak for us, this is, a strong message, I'm getting from the Africans in China. And as a Human Rights Watch, we're hope to speak to, leaders in the continent to ask them to be more forceful in their communication with the Chinese government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yancho. I would say the Chinese government is very rich coming from them about the coronavirus coming from foreign countries to China, when in fact it all started in China. And the government is currently complaining that other countries wish to investigate the beginning of the coronavirus, while at the same time they're accusing other countries of other people of bringing it into their country. There's something wrong there. Anyway, I want to thank you very much for your comments. Your update is as grim as Ambassador Arikana's statement was, and it certainly requires that the government of China take drastic action to correct this. I also agree very much with you and with Ambassador Arikana that the leadership of Africa and the African Union must stand up firmly and resist and do something about this. But we also must know that this requires a change of heart and perception. Government policy alone cannot change how one treats the other one. It comes from the heart. And if we are not treated or considered to be equals, then you're not going to be treating us as equals. And so we need to be able to get to the perception, get to the heart, get to the understanding, and get the Chinese and other people to understand who have come into our house to work, to invest, to eat, to drink, to be part of the community, that they are not superior to anyone, and back in China, not superior to anyone either. I'm very happy about the comments that you have made, and of course, which supports Dr. Arikana's very much so. Thank you, Yancho. Our next speaker is, I would have to call her the intrepid Miss Isabella Alexander-Nathani. I'm waiting to hear from her, actually with bated breath, to hear her presentation. She has a lot of vast, wide experience as a filmmaker, as a human rights activist, cultural anthropologist, and like I mentioned earlier, she has traveled on the rickety boats from Africa across the Mediterranean. And that is a very life-threatening situation. I now call on Isabella to take the stage.
Thank you so much. As mentioned, my work as a cultural anthropologist, a writer, and a documentary filmmaker is linked by this common interest that I have in international human rights, and specifically in how human rights are being applied to or denied to displaced populations. As a side note, I have a 2-month-old in my lap right now. It's one of the challenges of working from quarantine, so please bear with the screaming.
We're fine.
I'm going to broaden the lens of our discussion a little bit and move to looking at how this is affecting those who are still on the African continent. I've spent the past decade living between the US and North Africa, where I work with one of the world's largest populations of migrants and refugees, those who have fled conflict or extreme poverty in their home countries and who now find themselves trapped at Europe's southernmost borders in North Africa, in Morocco, in Algeria, and in Libya. The coronavirus pandemic comes tragically at a time when our world has a record number of displaced people. Migrants and refugees account for nearly 1 in every 100 people alive today, and more than half of them are children. In the past weeks, I've been reflecting on how this pandemic will affect them and what it reveals about how we define us and them in times of crisis, of social isolation, but also of global unity. So I first want to thank each of you who's joined us today for this talk. I want to thank you for being here with us and for showing through your presence that those whose human rights are being denied are not an invisible population. We see them, and together we have the power to lift their voices up. I'm going to first share with you a trailer from my new documentary film, which is called The Burning. And the film does just that. It tells the stories of 3 incredibly courageous families who have left their homes on journeys to safer shores. So I believe we have that queued up to play. And just as a side note, we noticed in the test run that if you see a black screen in the beginning, it's just a delay with the screen sharing. So if you bear with it, the video should catch up shortly.
I see Gordon Dapper.
Là, je m'en vais.
Là-bas, il n'y a rien ici.
Ils sont surveillés.
Oui.
Il m'a téléphoné. Il y a des étrangers, ils viennent, ils ont pris l'appareil chez vous et surveillés.
Je me souviens de tout.
Ne mana kelela, ne mana woyola, ni nana bendela, anga ben, no anti ben, ya fanema sabula kelema.
On a préparé des sauves pour aller en Europe. On a voyagé longtemps. Et c'est là au camion. Parfois, on a caché à l'arrière des petits camions. Quand on est arrivé au Maroc, on a dormi dans les forêts.
While the world's attention has been focused on Syrian refugees, 20 African people die every day trying to reach Europe. Over the last 3 years, I've been beaten and jailed by authorities, trying to stop me from filming families as they risk everything to escape hunger and violence.
You have to move tonight.
Come right there.
Le désert, c'est vraiment, c'est l'enfer. Moi, je vis des squelettes comme ça des jours. Je n'ai dit à personne.
All the people that here you are seeing in the forest, we are having the same intention.
On brûle nos papiers, on se sacrifie, allez juste rentrer en Europe.
Il est tombé gravement malade, ça n'allait plus. On est reparti dans le même hôpital, mais on ne dit rien. Quand il va là-bas, on lui donne, il a commencé à partir un peu.
For every migrant who makes it to Europe, 49 others die trying.
Nuestras misiones es como para evitar que puedan entrar saltando la valla.
L'Espagne et l'Union européenne financent l'expulsion des migrants.
Basonné, il est mort, on lui jette quelque part en forêt. Personne ne sait.
Il te frappe et des fois il casse les pieds des gens, il casse des bras.
Toutes les organisations des droits de l'homme crient que c'est illégal. C'est illégal. Qui va les écouter?
For these families, hope for the future is greater than fear of the present. It's time for their stories to be told.
Si Dieu fait que tu vas mourir dans l'eau, tu vas mourir. Mais que Dieu t'aide.
Audio.
Thanks. I really appreciate what Gordon said leading us into this part of the discussion, which is that changing policy alone is not enough. We have to change hearts. And one thing that I find especially powerful about combining research and storytelling is that it reminds us that even in the masses, even in the 68 million men, women, and children who are currently displaced, there's still the story of just one. I think it's important to attach names and faces and individual stories to the numbers, because it's easy for all of us to feel numbed by or to feel overwhelmed by these numbers. And because we also need to remember that at its heart, the migrant and refugee crisis is not a political issue, it's a human one. When I began filming The Burning back in 2016, I didn't know how each of these stories would end, simply that they needed to be shared. Heartbreakingly, each one of the families I followed lost at least one family member on their journeys north. From their beginnings in countries like Guinea, Mali, and the DRC, some have reached Europe, where they received asylum and they're rebuilding their lives. Some others are back at their starting points, rebuilding their lives at home. And unfortunately, many of the families remain still trapped in transit countries, in hidden forest camps and detention centers across North Africa. I'm making final edits to this film right now as we speak, and I'm excited to share the full thing with you all later this year. I can't think of a more important time for us to come together to fight for human rights, and especially for the rights of those who do not have a home that they can shelter in. As countries around the world have grappled with a growing pandemic and with their own dwindling resources in past months, there have been drastic changes affecting the lives of African migrants and refugees, and of migrants and refugees more largely. One of the questions that's troubled me the most during this time is where this vulnerable population is supposed to turn as borders are being locked, search and rescue missions are largely being abandoned, and ports are being closed for the foreseeable future. The Mediterranean Sea, which is a region that's been central to my own research, is one of the most trafficked and also the deadliest border regions in the world today. Boarding inflatable rafts like the one you see in this film, hundreds of African migrants and refugees place their lives at risk every day in hopes of surviving this final leg of their long and treacherous journeys towards safer shores. Those setting off from the Moroccan coast head directly towards Spain, which at its shortest point is only about 8 miles. Those in Libya, however, set off on longer and even more treacherous routes across the Mediterranean towards the closest European ports, which are located in Italy and in Malta. Departures always rise in the spring when the risk of hypothermia drops and the sea calms. But this year, the departures have risen even higher than we anticipated, and it's not because of the pandemic. An increase in shootings and bombings as war fire spreads across Tripoli have added to the number of spring departures. Libya's capital city is home to thousands of migrants and refugees who are being held in detention centers that are well documented for their brutality. They're often held in these centers until their families are able to pay the high fees that are demanded for their release. This population is desperately seeking to escape not only the homes that they once fled, but now also the transit country where they're trapped and vulnerable to abuse, to rape, to extortion, and to forced labor. In our Q&A in just a bit, I'll be addressing directly how some of these changes have affected African migrants and refugees on the ground, as we see member states across the EU repeatedly failing to meet their international obligations for search and rescue, and simply abandoning those who are stranded at sea. Last week alone, there were a shocking 258 individuals who were left in distress. The only open port was in the country they had fled. For those 258, and for the hundreds of thousands of others like them around the world, I think the question remains, are we really all in this together? Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much. Thank you, Isabella. Your passion, your 3-minute video that started the program just tugs at our hearts. We see hope, we see desperation, but we also know that much of this hope, expectation is dashed. And we do know that many people ask the question, am I not better? Would I not be better off remaining in my country, in Africa? And the hope is that we can create an Africa that no one wants to leave, including.
Absolutely. And just as an aside, some of the happiest endings in the film are of those who have returned to different regions of their home country that are stable and are rebuilding beautiful lives there that are positively impacting the family and the whole community.
Fantastic. And thank you so very much. Thank you, Isabella. Our next speaker is Mr. Richard Towle, the Deputy Director of United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the office in New York. And I would like to invite him to speak to us now, centered on the challenge of coronavirus in these camps. Richard?
Well, thank you very much indeed, and greetings to everybody in all parts of the planet as we're all hunkered down in different places, all facing the same threat, but in different circumstances. And I want to really much thank the organizers for this timely discussion today, and particularly cast perhaps a humanitarian view, building a little on what Isabella has very graphically spoken about in the video just now. I think to put the human and people face onto these massive numbers of displaced people and refugees that we're seeing around the world today, it's very easy to be numbed or anesthetized when we talk about 70 million people who have been displaced. But if we remember that behind every one of those is a story of a mother or a father or a child with hopes and aspirations of a better future, one can understand how important it is that we keep this human connection at a time when we're very fearful as societies about what our future might hold. So I wanted just in 1 minute just to say that the predicament for refugees only 3 months ago, pre-COVID, was already very, very precarious. 70 million people and more were displaced from their homes and already living in very, very difficult and dangerous circumstances. Many already condemned to the margins of society, scraping by as best as they could from the livelihoods that were available to them in the market economies of wherever they find themselves, living very much at the bottom of the socioeconomic community, trying to do the best. So refugees were already in a very, very fragile state. And one must almost remember that of the 70 million displaced people around the world today, 85% of those are living in the developing world, in countries where they're already finding it difficult to look after their own populations, and frequently and invariably reach out and look after refugees and foreigners as best they can in difficult circumstances with huge generosity. And I'm thinking particularly in Africa, where there are 27 million displaced people, and the generosity of African peoples is unmatched when one considers what resources and limited resources there are. So the first comment I want to make is the burden on looking after the world's displaced primarily falls on countries that can least afford to do it. And those countries that can most afford to do it are historically, and most recently since COVID, now putting up barriers and blockages and difficulties for people to move. Those barriers were already difficult enough, and one heard from Isabella a little some of the difficulties trying to move across from North Africa into the Mediterranean and southern borders of Europe. Those were already difficult and dangerous enough 3 months ago. And now, as a result of steps taken by governments to protect their own peoples by closing down borders, quarantine their populations, this has an enormous and negative impact on what we call the quality of asylum for refugees around the world. So the first thing that concerns us most in terms of responding to the crisis is how do we preserve the institution and protection of asylum for people who still need to escape from conflict and violence and serious human rights violations. They have now the added hurdle that governments that previous to this period would leave their borders open are now shutting borders. People are being quarantined, detention facilities are often closed, and freedom of movement, the one thing that refugees and others require to maintain some semblance of normality and survival in their lives, is now being blocked off for them. So what we're seeing, and if I may, Gordon, just go through, there are probably 8 or 9 very important COVID-related consequences of what is already an overstretched humanitarian situation for refugees. The first, as I said, is relating to the contraction of the asylum space itself. It's very difficult now for men, women, and children who need protection to get good quality protection from those who need it. Secondly, it's very difficult for refugees to get access to the quality of healthcare that they need, not only in relation to responding to COVID-19, but also to get access to the healthcare that they need and mental health and other kinds of support they need to get over the trauma of displacement. Many are living in places where the healthcare systems are at best basic and can easily be overwhelmed and are being overwhelmed by the huge challenges posed by COVID-19. If you couple that with the living conditions of refugees and displaced people today, many are living in very congested, dense areas. If they are now no longer able to move freely, then that density and congestion continues. So we're very concerned that COVID-19, an easily transferable disease, can rip through quite rapidly through refugee and congested spaces. Refugees do not have the privilege or the benefit of being able to do social distancing. It's physically and socially impossible for them. One thinks of 800,000 to 1 million Myanmar refugees, Rohingya refugees living in Bangladesh. They do not have the luxury of social distancing, and many of the refugees in Africa do not either. So population density and congestion are huge problems for everybody, but particularly for refugees who already find themselves in these situations. The second really is the vulnerability of women and children and the elderly. Women already facing difficulties given the disruption to their normal traditional lifestyles, higher incidence of domestic violence against women and exploitation of children will go up given the situation of extreme challenge as we're facing today. The third area which all populations around the world are facing, but will particularly impact on refugee communities, is the socioeconomic impact. As governments divert their financial and other resources to looking after their own problems, it's going to become increasingly difficult to raise the humanitarian resources we need to look after refugees and to take care of them. And at the same time, many refugees are working and living at the bottom end of the socioeconomic chain, if you like. The work that they do is often unskilled or semi-skilled, and those are the first casualties in a labour market economy. If they're not able to move and the jobs that they require to keep food on the table for their families disappear, then a drive towards poverty is something that is profoundly concerning for refugee communities. The collapse of the grey economy will be a very, very serious, not only short-term but longer-term challenge for refugees. Where is the resources and the income that give them dignity going to come from if jobs and work dry up? The other immediate impact, of course, is for education. Kids who would often go to school in difficult circumstances, the one semblance of normality for children in a refugee or displacement situation is to go to school and be with their families and children of the same age and forget about the horrors of war and conflict around them. 90% of the world's school kids are now in various forms of quarantining. Schools have been shut. Refugee schools frequently now not open. They're in difficult places. Teachers are not there available, and education for children is going to be hugely impacted upon. The other area, of course, is that medical care that is required to address diseases and other things is sidelined, and there is profound risk of food insecurity developing, particularly in Africa, where there have been floods. If you look at Sudan with locusts and floods and various other challenges posed, the COVID-19 poses yet another shock on top of an already shocked population of people. So these are huge, huge challenges for everybody, and why it's really important that the only way of addressing this is through joining together, supporting the World Health Organization, supporting the agencies and the brave men and women and organizations that are working together. What we do know about this challenge of COVID-19 is that if you try and go on your own, you will fail. You must go in concert and cooperation with everybody else, because the disease will find out the weakest link, and that will compromise everybody. It's really important that refugees are brought in and included in the healthcare response. And I think that's one of the satisfactory or more positive elements of what we're seeing around the world. Refugees who have frequently been excluded from any kind of social services are in many places now being included and incorporated into public health care responses, precisely because governments realize that if they don't do that, if they leave them as marginalized to fend for themselves, this will impact on their own health of their own population. So there is a very good reason, both self-serving and humanitarian, why refugees and the marginalized people must be brought into a comprehensive healthcare response and must be included in whatever socioeconomic development that takes place as the disease starts to withdraw. But at the end of the day, and I'll just finish with really, I think, reinforcing what Elizabeth said, and this is the most powerful thing of all. We have to remember that this is about people whose only fault in life was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Refugees are like ordinary people escaping from horrors that most of us can only but imagine. And to finish with a quotation from Rabbi Jonathan Magenet that appeals to me greatly is, he said something along the lines, we are defined as a society precisely by the way we treat the stranger or the foreigner. And I think that's a great deal in that. We can be very self-content with our own societies and communities, but it is when we are tested most is how we treat those who come from some other place, who ask for help and assistance. And that's why humanitarian support for refugees and displaced people, even at a time where it is vexing minds and budgets and resources of all countries around the world, is absolutely important, because we will finally be judged by how everybody is supported, not just by a few. So thank you very much, and I look forward to being part of the conversation.
Maura? Okay. 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 Oh, there I am. I'm in a little different position than I had been earlier, and let me do that. Okay, fine. Again, thank you, Richard, for your comments. I don't think people really understand what UNHCR, UNESCO, UNFPA, UNDP, UNAIDS, and all those organizations do for the world. World Food Program, the number of marginalized, disadvantaged, displaced persons that these organizations have to attend to, take care of, build housing, provide water, sanitation, food, medicine, take care of young kids. It's a mammoth task. If these organizations did not exist, the world would have to create these organizations, and the world would have to fund these organizations, not take funds from these organizations. And I thank you for all your behalf of UNHCR and on behalf of all the displaced, the disadvantaged, and the so-called homeless people in the international community. Thank you so very much, Richard.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gordon.
Good. All righty. Okay. We're now moving into the second part of our program, and this will have our panel, our resident panel of experts who will be answering some questions. Among them will be Dr. Mohammed Nurhussein. He's the chairman of the United African Congress. He is the professor of medicine emeritus and former chief of geriatrics at State University of New York, Downstate Medical Center. We also have Dr. Judy Kuriansky, United Nations representative of the International Association of Applied Psychology, professor in the Department of Clinical Psychology at Columbia, trustee of the United African Congress, and psychosocial first responder and trainer in many infectious diseases, epidemics, and natural disasters. We also have Mr. Milton Allimadi. He's a Ugandan by birth, adjunct professor of African history at John Jay College, a Pan-Africanist, human rights activist, and publisher of the Black Star News. Lastly, we have Ms. Stephanie Evans, the Director of Education and Associate Professor at the Harlem Hospital. She's the Director of the Give Them a Hand Foundation. I will ask Dr. Judy Kuriansky, one of the resident panelists, a question and have her say something about her work at the United Nations and about the Sustainable Development Goals. She is, as I stated before, the representative of the International Association of Applied Psychology. Dr. Judy, you've been an advocate at the United Nations for many years and involved in negotiations on behalf of civil society for major UN agenda. How is this issue of racism dealt with?
Thank you very much, Gordon, and thank you to everyone who's been on the chat with their powerful comments and appreciation, and to the panelists with extremely moving and very erudite, intelligent, and also from their heart and their mind, as we've mentioned about the heart as a psychologist, that means a great deal to me in terms of this issue. In the context of COVID-19 and this terrible pandemic, the bottom line point is that we are all in this together and we must work together, as Richard has just said. And so therefore, I want to give a context of what's going on the international stage from the very beginning with regard to the agreements and what the United Nations and its agencies, as you have mentioned, Gordon, and the NGO civil society movement have been doing with regard to anti-racism, anti-discrimination, and dignity and rights for all, to put a context in this discussion. So I'm going to share my screen now to show you some slides about this, to visually be able to show you what's going on here. So, with regard to the powerful screen, the powerful film that Isabel showed about the transit of people who are looking for their freedom, this is the memorial that is right on the grounds of the United Nations. So it is a powerful reminder right there when you pass the gates and try to go into the United Nations building of the honoring of the millions of people who were forcibly removed from Africa to the Americas, including from the Caribbean and from Europe. And it puts the UN headquarters right in the symbol of what the UN represents, promoting and preserving the dignity and the worth of all human beings, the principles that are central to the UN Charter. You see here the memorial, and that is a statue of a person, of a slave who has gone through this. The UN is founded on two pillars. Right away, there is peace and security, because why? The UN was founded in the time of World War II, when there was not peace and security. And the second pillar is human rights, which is what we are talking about here. So this is the foundation and the pillars of the United Nations system. The two milestone documents that date back to that time of World War II is the Charter of the United Nations and the Statute of the International Court of Justice, which was in 1945. Now that had to be elaborated into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that you see on the bottom there. You're looking at Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the president, the United States president at the time, Roosevelt. And that document, those two documents really outline in a milestone way the commitment of governments, to human rights and dignity and the worth of every person, to promote the universal rights regardless of race, sex, language, or religion, and all these freedoms. So those were important. Over time, there has been much progress, many, many UN declarations and resolutions. Eventually, this led to the Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of racial discrimination that was drafted in 1962. Interestingly, there are African countries that played a big role in that initial drafting: Chad, Guinea, Ivory Coast, and Mali. That led to the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of violence and racial discrimination in 1969, and the governments having responsibility. And what was important is that they would be monitored, so they had to comply to this. A next big milestone was the UN World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance in 2001. And then the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which happens every March 21st, not so long ago. And the International Decade for Peoples of African Descent, which was from 2015 all the way goes to 2024. In some major countries that have been very active in this from the beginning drafting are Canada, Costa Rica, Ghana, Jamaica, and Mexico. Now, Jamaica has led a big role because in the monument that I showed you before, it was actually the commission that led to the development of that monument on the UN Plaza, and the ambassador of Jamaica was part of that commission, which is very important, as was a UN representative from civil society, a good friend of mine, Dr. Koran Okorodudu. So the next major important document from the UN that is so critical to this entire discussion that we are happening is the UN Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, that I was very honored to be able to participate in that negotiations on the part of civil society. That was a document that was agreed upon by the governments, the 193 member states of the United Nations, for the governments to commit to these 17 goals that you're seeing there, 1 to 17. Of sustainable development that they have committed to achieve by the year 2030. Goal 10, I bring your attention to, you see it right there in red on the right, which is to reduce inequalities. So the governments of the world have agreed that this will be achieved by the year 2020, 30. We talked before, Gordon mentioned, and of course, we did have Richard representing UNHCR. So UN agencies have played a major role also in anti-racism and anti-discrimination and the rights and the dignity and respect for all persons. UNESCO, one of the UN agencies, was very, very active in this from the very beginning during the time of World War II. You see their building there in Paris, and their logo at the bottom, the UNHCR building right there in Geneva, and their logo, and of course WHO, which was mentioned also in Geneva. Civil society, as I mentioned, has also played a big role. Being a psychologist, I'm very pleased about the role of psychologists, because UNESCO did ask psychologists and social psychologists during the war to do research on the strategies to combat racism. This really set a huge foundation for all those other documents and resolutions that I was telling you about before. Currently now, there has been an NGO committee for the elimination of racism, Afrophobia, and colorism, and another NGO committee of civil society at the United Nations is on migration, with a subcommittee on xenophobia and the inclusion of migrants and refugees. So Richard, that's very relevant to what you were talking about. And you see there a picture of many of the psychologists who belong to many of these committees. And in the front there in blue is me. And then on the right there is Dr. Koran Okorodudu, who I mentioned to you has been very, very influential in this whole progress. So I'll finish with saying that as we all know, with regard to the message with COVID-19, we are all in this together. We have to solve the virus itself and a better world for all of us based on goal 17, which is that we all need to be partners to achieve those goals and to achieve the world that we want, which is a phrase from the UN, leaving no one behind, another phrase used at the UN, and that we can achieve dignity and respect for all that the UN Charter is based on. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Judy. I should mention to you, when you're talking about that monument, the memorial at the United Nations on the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, that the mission of Jamaica was influential in making happen.
Yes, I did say that. The ambassador was the chair of that committee.
I was the project manager for that installation. Okay?
Because there is a huge connection between Jamaica and their role and Africa. So yes, indeed.
I was the project manager, a young Haitian architect.
Yes, that's right. It was a Haitian American who was the architect picked to make that memorial. Yes, exactly.
Very good. And as a Jamaican, I must say that Jamaica is a part of Africa, has always been.
Exactly. Thank
But
you.
now I have just received a couple of questions, and I'm going to ask Milton Allimadi from Black Star to pose this question. I think it is directed at Isabella. Milton?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Can you see me? I think I'm probably muted.
Yes. Do you have the question?
My question to Professor Alexander-Nathani,
right,
is given the abysmal situation that already existed in terms of the tragic conditions that the Africans that are trying to migrate across the Mediterranean were already facing. Now we compound that with the global pandemic. It's unimaginable what kind of situation they must be facing right now. Does Professor Alexander-Nathani have any recent examples of some of the tragic conditions they may be facing? And the other part of the question is a bit bigger, and I know it's a tall measure, but what is to be done? What can be done ultimately? For example, in your documentary, at the end of it, what are some of the things you suggest to be done?
Thank you for those questions. They're big questions, like you said. I will try to address them briefly, being aware of the time that we have together. So first, to pull attention to the Mediterranean Sea, which is a region that's really at the heart of the African and European crises of migration and asylum right now. For people who aren't familiar, this is an area of water that's traditionally patrolled by the coast guards that are at the border. So every individual nation that's signatory to these international conventions has entered into an agreement to patrol what we call your search and rescue zone, or your SAR zone, immediately outside of your country. So this would be true for those along Southern Europe, countries like Spain, like Greece, like Italy, like Malta, and is similarly true for countries in North Africa that are patrolling the opposite sides of the water. In recent years, though, we've seen the Coast Guard activity start to withdraw in this area for reasons that I'm sure you can imagine. And in its place, we've had a number of NGOs that have taken over and have taken over that obligation of patrolling what's become, as I mentioned, one of our deadliest border regions. So these are independent NGOs that have rescue ships in this water that are responding to distress calls when you have old fishing boats or rafts that are in distress with anywhere between 20 and 150 people aboard. However, in just the last year, European nations have started to criminalize this behavior. And in response to that, even these NGO ships have started to withdraw. So there have been a number of prominent cases against Spanish rescue organizations and Italian rescue organizations, again, all non-governmental, in which the captains of the ships and those working aboard them have actually been charged with human smuggling for rescuing those who are in distress at sea and bringing them to shores where their cases can be processed and they can either receive asylum or be properly repatriated to their home countries. So in March, just as this pandemic was beginning to explode around the world, there was only a single ship that was operating in the entire Mediterranean Sea organization, the entire Mediterranean Sea region, a ship from a German organization called CI. So you can imagine this is a massive area, really difficult to be patrolled by a single ship, especially when, as I said, in a single week, we have up to 258 individuals who are placing calls in distress. So I'll speak just to what's transpired in the past week. We received official declarations from both Italy and Malta that their borders, their ports, were entirely closed with no end date in sight. So closed for the foreseeable future. This means that both their coast guards, which are not operating in the region, and these independent rescue organizations are not allowed to bring those who have risked everything to make the journey across to safer shores. So what it meant for this rescue ship, which was the one operating in the Mediterranean, was that there was no port to take the rescued individuals to except the ports that they had fled, those in Libya. And so what we have right now is this critical region in which ports to the north are firmly closed for the foreseeable future, and the only open port is a port in a country that is not only in active war, but a country in which the detention centers are among the most brutal that we've documented in the world right now. Sure. So to answer the second part of Milton's question, it's incredibly important that we provide safe landing places to those who are found in the Mediterranean Sea. And we know that Libya is not currently a safe place. That's been well documented by researchers, and it's also been backed up by international organizations like the UNHCR and the IOM, who concur that this is not a safe place for us to be returning people to. So I think one of the most critical matters is for us to point our attention to this region and to the desperate need for safe landing ports.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I also think we should highlight the irony in closing ports in the name of public health. It's always an argument being made, in the name of public health, we can't allow migrants and asylum seekers to come because we don't have the ability to test and we're trying to contain the virus within our own borders. But, to leave 258 people to drown in the name of public health, there's certainly a statement there about whose life is valued and whose is not.
Absolutely. Thank you for your response.
Okay, thank you very much, Milton. Thank you, Isabel. I also understand that Dr. Nurhussein has a question to ask. Dr. Nurhussein.
Isabella, for that really wonderful video, gut-wrenching to watch, actually, about the plight of these migrants. You've spoken about the situation that migrants and refugees are fleeing from, both in their home countries and also in the transit countries in North Africa. Can you speak in more detail about the conditions in these places? You touched on that briefly, given your recent experience on the ground.
Certainly. The majority of my time has been spent between Morocco, Algeria, and Libya. And the conditions for the migrant and refugee populations that end up trapped in these three countries, they vary quite dramatically from one to the other. So, for instance, in Morocco, there's a lack of official prisons or detention centers to house migrants and refugees, which means that the vast majority of them end up living in these sort of makeshift camps in the forests surrounding the Spanish enclaves. So a lot of people aren't aware that there actually remain two small pieces of Spain in northern Morocco. The enclaves are called Ceuta and Melilla. They're about 4 and 7 square miles in size, so quite small. But what they serve to do is to bring the European border within the African continent. So it's the only place on the entire continent where you can reach Europe without having to cross the Mediterranean Sea. And for that reason, it's a big draw for people who are attempting to escape either conflict or extreme poverty. It means that you don't have to pay the smuggling fees, which are quite high. And it means that you can try again and again. So we have thousands, tens of thousands of people congregating in hidden forest camps around the enclaves, and they'll often band together in large groups and attempt to storm what is now 3 rings of border fences that are securing these 2 Spanish enclaves there. There's a complete lack of proper protocol with regard to asylum processing in these spaces. Individuals who are presenting there at this border to claim asylum are not even asked so much as their name or the country they're fleeing. They're simply being pushed back. The Spanish state calls it a pushback into Morocco. In Libya, the situation is quite different. Because there's a lack of a formal state structure, we've seen a lot of rebel groups that have taken hold of this as an opportunity to make money and to profit off of a large population that's willing to work in order to make money to make a final escape. So there are several both state-run and independently run detention centers and prisons where the majority of those who are trapped in Libya end up. The conditions in these spaces are absolutely deplorable. I've never seen anything like them. And one of the only ways for those who are trapped there to escape is to be able to pay these high fees that those running the centers demand in order for the release. It's a ransom of sorts. So they call on the families of the individuals who are trapped there to pay the fees. And if the individuals don't have any family members, or if their family members don't have any money to pay, which is often the case and the reason why they fled in the first place, one thing they're able to do is to work off their their sentence, to work off the fees. So it's something akin to a slave labor camp, where you have individuals working on mostly large state-run construction projects in exchange for their freedom. So you can imagine what this means for those individuals who are risking their lives to escape this country, and then being told every port in Southern Europe is closed, and all that these rescue ships can do is to bring you back to Libya, where you may have spent already anywhere between 1 and 10 years under these really deplorable conditions. Thinking towards positive solutions to this, there are a lot of individuals who at that point would choose to return home, who would like to find other safe spaces within the African continent if returning home is not an option. And so I think, at the larger policy level, thinking about the massive amount of money and resources that are invested in our border control, and how instead that money can be reinvested to make more safe spaces for return on the African continent.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Isabella.
Thank
and
you.
Thank you very much for that question, Dr. Nurhussein. I think you have given some clarification on that situation. Time is running out on us, but we're going to take some questions from the audience. I think we have a few questions. And we have a young lady, Lily, who has been taking these questions, and she will ask, she will pose these questions. So we will take 3 questions at the most. And Lily, if you
should mention that Lily is a graduate student at Columbia University Teachers College, where she's in my class about psychology and the United Nations. So she is very well aware and really committed and interested in this exact subject.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a few questions that I pulled from both the chat and the Q&A box. The first one that I wanted to just pose to the panelists and speakers in general, it's not directed at anyone specifically, have any African government or unions reached out and reacted to what is happening in China? How are those targeted in China doing now?
I would take that question. Yes, there are governments, including Nigeria, Uganda, and Ghana, and they summoned Chinese ambassadors in their country to protest. And then there are also ambassadors from several African countries, including Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, calling for the Chinese government to cease forceful testing, quarantine, and other inhumane treatment meted out to Africans. And there are also more than 300 human rights groups and nearly 1,800 activists in Africa sent an open letter to the African Union calling for immediate remedial action over the xenophobic, racist, and inhumane treatment of Africans in China. So there have been a wave outreach towards the situation in China. However, as I said, the Chinese government has denied and saying, that they basically didn't acknowledge this thing is going on. They only said, we have zero tolerance for discrimination. It's just rhetoric. I think we need to understand there's a background, which is that in the past 2 decades, China has become Africa's most important economic partner. So China's investment in Africa through the Belt and Road Initiative, it's China's $1 trillion investment in infrastructure across 70 countries around the world has boosted Africa's economy. So it also lent the Chinese government considerable influence on the continent. That is, contributed to the African government's lack of criticism towards Chinese authorities for their mistreatment of Africans in China.
Wow.
Thank you very much. Lily, I would also like to hear from Dr. Arikana, if she is still here. For I know she wrote a very strong letter to President Xi. I don't know if she has gotten a response. Is Dr. Arikana still available?
No, Dr. Arikana is not still available.
Okay. We had a very busy schedule today, so I doubt very much that she would have been able to stay on for the entire time. Okay, you could proceed with 2 other questions.
Okay, next question I have is, can change happen with political figures in African countries when they rely so heavily on Chinese investment?
Richard, do you want to take a start at that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. I think it's actually a two-way street. It reminds me of many years ago, I think it was in the 1970s, when Mexico started borrowing a lot of money from Citibank. It was a couple of millions. It was tens of millions of dollars. And it was a Mexican problem. And Citibank was pressing Mexico for that money. And at some point, it added up to $100 million. And Citibank was still pressing. But Mexico said, listen, this is not a Mexican problem anymore. At $100 million, this is a Citibank problem. So let's deal with it mutually. And they did. So they had to find a solution mutually. And I bring that up to say that in this case, it's not a one-way street, because China has billions of dollars worth of investments in African countries. Those are physically assets that China invested in. And those African countries at some point could make it uncomfortable for China. So China has to see this as not only Africa being dependent on China, but China is also dependent on Africa. And I think once that is made clear, I think the Chinese government will take a different attitude, a much more constructive attitude in this matter. That's how I see it.
Okay, thank you very much. I agree. And as a matter of fact, I want one of our next webinars to focus on Africa taking control of Africa and African resources.
Good.
Lily, another question from you?
Yes. So this question actually could be posed specifically for Richard. What measures are being taken to curb the spread of coronavirus amongst migrants and refugees, especially in those transit countries?
Richard?
Thank you very much for the question. I don't know if you can hear me, can you?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, please. No, thank you very much for the question. In my first remarks, I wanted to highlight really the challenges of it, because where most of the refugees and migrant and displaced communities are in places where the healthcare systems themselves are hugely challenged and compromised, basic even in the best of times. So to scale them up to deal with a problem like this is going to be enormously difficult. What I would say is that the UN, led by the Secretary General and some very able heads of agencies, World Health and IOM, UNHCR and others, have really been able to mobilize quite a lot of resources. For us, UNHCR in very short space of time was able to mobilize $255 million precisely to get resources, PPE, equipment, camp materials directly to governments to help them deal with the pandemic in places where refugees are. Now clearly the scale is enormous, but there is a lot being done. And I think we've heard a lot today of the negative things that are going on, but there are some quite promising positive things. And that is the level of cooperation between partners who normally don't talk to each other. Governments, economists, healthcare systems and ministries are now directly talking to those who work around refugee and migrant communities, precisely because they do realize that if you don't deal with the weakest link in your response, you're never going to be able to deal with it effectively. We've seen that here in New York, where the African American and Hispanic communities have been hit much harder than everybody else because they haven't had the luxury of being able to socially distance. The underlying health issues are not the same. And quite frankly, many of those people have been doing the essential service work, often unrecognized and underpaid. So this is what we see with refugee communities and migrant communities as well. They are doing invisible work, keeping economies going, clearing the rubbish, doing things that ordinary populations and communities don't want to do. And now we're starting to see those communities more vigorously, and I think in the daylight, and there is an opportunity to include them. So it's really a question of how we go forward on this. If we go back, once the virus recedes, if we go back to the old way of doing things, migrants and refugees will become invisible again. And that will impact on the social and development trajectory of governments. And Dr. Judy, I very much liked your link back to the reference to the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. If we leave outside huge parts of our invisible populations, then development will be compromised for all. And this is what requires a whole new conversation, I think, between governments and host communities and migrant communities, including refugees. So in Africa, I think, fortunately so far, the disease has not taken hold in the ways that we've seen in other places. I'm no specialist, so now I don't know fully why that is, but we have deep concerns that if it does take hold amongst migrant and refugee communities that are densely living together, then it will go through them very, very rapidly with devastating consequences. But it's the socio-economic damage and challenge that's going to be caused to these populations that we really also need to look at. The disease is one thing, but the damage to fabric of communities, I think, is going to be far more challenging. And that requires us all to work together. Coming back to, I think, the golden thread theme from today's discussion is that no government, no organization can work on its own. We have to work closely, leave aside our differences, and unite ourselves as a common people. And that means mobilizing the resources, doing the testing, providing the PPE and equipment that's required for everybody to take advantage of it. And we'll be judged by this in 5 or 10, or our grandchildren will judge how we dealt with this, not by how the wealthy people dealt with it, but how we dealt, how the poor and the marginalized and the underprivileged were looked after during this period. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Lily, you have one more question.
Yeah, one last question I have for Dr. Nurhussein. How can UAC help youth to change, stop, and reduce these brutalities that are happening on migrants in Europe and America?
Well, UAC has been doing what it is doing right now. First of all, bringing awareness to the problem, to the situation, and bring pressure to bear on governments through action. And basically, I think the more we are aware of the situation, of the problem existing, the better we can actually try to solve the problem. I think we intend to do a series of webinars, as Gordon said earlier, focusing on specific areas of concern. And for example, when Ebola struck in West Africa, United African Congress was among the first to raise awareness of the gravity of the situation, when the rest of the world was seemingly indifferent. And we had the forum of the United Nations to highlight, to really underscore that point. And of course, we're happy to say that we had some impact, nudging governments to take forceful action on that. But I just want to quickly, if I may, ask question to Richard, or for that matter, Isabella, if they're still here. Richard, are you there? Well,
yes, I'm here. I am here, yes.
Okay. I mean, one of the, talking about the migrants and refugees, we realize that the problem is really getting worse instead of better. And part of it is that no one is held accountable, although many of these countries are signatories to the various charters and conventions. And yet they flagrantly flouted those conventions. And I would like particularly to emphasize, at least we have conventions and charters on the refugees. The other group of people that are really sort of overlooked are the internally displaced persons. And if I can remember, there are over 50 million internally displaced people around the world. Ethiopia, for one, is said to have an estimated 3 million IDPs. So are they governed by the same conventions as the refugees, since most of these countries are within the border of a country and would require the consent of that government for any agency to intervene, or am I mistaken? Maybe you can shed light on that.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I think you're absolutely right. We talk about the 26 million refugees. Refugees, for the audience who are still there, are people who've been able to cross over an international boundary and ask for protection from another country, from another state. Internally displaced people, we call them IDPs in our business, are people who are stuck within their own countries, but often leaving for exactly the same reasons: conflict, persecution, serious human rights violations, and sometimes the combination of these things with shocks relating to the natural climate and natural environment. So the refugee is protected by a body of international law, at the heart of which is the 1951 Refugee Convention, and more than 140 countries around the world have signed that. It provides a very, very good referable accountability framework for how to treat refugees. But there isn't a global treaty or convention for how to respond to internally displaced people. There are lots of human rights that are applicable to it. The one big exception, I would say, is in Africa itself. There is a Kampala Convention for internally displaced people, which does actually prescribe the rights and responsibilities of governments and displaced people, precisely to try and provide a level of predictable cooperation and protection for those people. So Africa is leading the way in terms of providing a legal and normative framework for protecting that very important group of people. Gordon, I think it's about 42 million IDPs around the world today, so it's actually almost coming up to double the number of refugees, and yet it's often a more invisible problem because these are people from the country which they still call their own, and yet many of them are living in very desperate and difficult circumstances, which will be compounded now by the effects of COVID-19 as the economic and social stresses come on all communities. Those who are already most vulnerable will suffer even more acutely than the others. So in places like Sudan, we're aware of this, and we're trying now to make sure that as we try and help the new government of Sudan forge its way with the challenges it has, that the UN itself is able to offer a much more effective range of support, from the humanitarian to the development and the security and the financial funding which they desperately need. So that's the challenge, is to get all those elements together to help governments in their time of greatest need and their peoples of greatest need. But you're absolutely right, it's the IDPs. There is a very, very large group of extremely vulnerable people.
All right, thank you very much for that question, Dr. Mohammed, and thank you very much for your response, Richard. I hope it won't be in the near future, but I do hope that we will have better conditions for people who are displaced. As a matter of fact, we can obviate the need for people to be displaced. We need more harmony, we need more peace, we need more love in this world. Anyway, I think we have basically run our course. I want to thank Dr. Arikana, Ambassador Arikana. I want to thank Isabella. I want to thank Richard, and I want to thank Yaqui Wang for being speakers on this panel, this webinar today. And as always, our resident panel of experts, Dr. Judy, Dr. Nurhussein, and Milton Allimadi. Oh, I see Dr. Arikana is here. And I really want to thank you. There was a question that was posed earlier about what can we do to address the situation of the way Black people are treated. And Yangzhou took a crack at it, and she did a very good job. Perhaps you would want to say your piece on that. We know you wrote a letter to President Xi, and don't know if you ever received a response or if you had received support from any country for the letter you wrote. I know that your letter was widely circulated in the diaspora here in the United States, and everyone gave 2 thumbs up for what you said. Perhaps you want to comment?
I have not received a response yet. The official letter was sent through the diplomatic channels, through the Chinese embassy here in Washington, D.C. I'm yet to receive a response. I'm sure it will come. We also have a petition that's going on. I hope everybody can sign the petition where we are asking President Xi and his citizens to stop abusing Black people. So please, let's circulate that. If we can get to 100,000 signatures, then we'll also deliver those 100,000 signatures to President Xi Jinping. So please, I urge everybody to go to change.org and look up that petition from African Diaspora Congress. It's on the web. When it comes to what we can do as Black people to change our circumstances, it all boils down to the mind. We are suffering from the legacy of slavery and colonization. While we may have lost the chains in our legs and hands, the chains of our brains still continue. Wherein lies our serious problem. We are the only race that have so much deep self-hate that we can't see ourselves getting out of that box and uniting for the sheer survival. Residing here in the United States, we are surrounded by other races that stick together like superglue. They may not like each other as individuals, but when it comes to their race, they come together like superglue. No Black man can walk into Chinatown in New York and try to establish a business and succeed. Absolutely not, it won't happen. And yet, a Chinaman can walk into a Black neighborhood and start his business, and we Black people will walk past the Black man's business and go over to patronize the Chinaman, and in no time, we put the Black brother out of business. We do those stupid things on a daily basis, where we fail to realize that while other races, Chinese money circulates in their community 14 times, the white people's money circulates in their community 18 times, the Mexicans about 9 times. Our money as Black people, it barely makes it around the block, and it's already out of our communities. At what point are we going to understand that while we may have been put to sleep, while we may have been put in the condition that we are in, but that we can do something about it? And the journey begins with our unity. The journey begins with our understanding that at the end of the day, it's about us first. Those who put us in this position that we are in, we don't expect them to liberate us. We have to demand our respect. We have to demand our liberation. But for us to be able to do that from a solid ground, the mind has got to change. That is why I wrote my book, which is titled Africa 101, The Wake Up Call. Everybody must wake up. Black people must wake up and realize that, like other races, we too must unite, and we too must speak with one voice and realize we are inheritors of one of the most amazing continents, and that the continent is waiting for us. But we will not be good for the continent. We cannot claim our inheritance unless we unite. So to my brothers and sisters of African descent, let's wake up so we can join hands and do what needs to be done for our race.
Thank you. That's a rousing conclusion to today's meeting. Thank you very much. Inspiring, very inspiring, Dr. Arikana. I'm sorry I keep going between Dr. Arikana and Ambassador Arikana.
I am more used to being Dr. Arikana. For 30 years, they called me Dr. C. And so that's quite all right. I'm more comfortable in that arena.
Okay, very good. Thank you. We're going to wrap up now, and we will wrap up with a statement from one of our resident panelists, Stephanie Evans. She is the Director of Medicine at the Harlem Hospital and associate professor. Also, she served at Columbia University School of Medicine for several years, and she has the skills. She's a public health specialist, and we will hear something from her, a wrap up of our program. And before I do that, I want to thank Maura for her support, her technical support, as well as Lily and everyone who has worked to make this possible. Thank you all. Now we can hear from Stephanie. Stephanie? Hello, Stephanie? Stephanie Evans.
You've given me, thank you so much, Gordon. Thank you so much. If the host can unmute me, then that would be great. You've given me a lot of titles here. You're giving me a lot of titles that I would like to talk about moving forward. Some of them today was inspiring and all the speakers were good. And we want to talk about what we saw quickly in wrapping up. One thing we know that coronavirus is no respect of persons, no gender, no ethnicity, no age or stage is spared from the virus. This virus has caused us to pause, and it has exposed all the frailties in our human condition, the economic disparities, the health disparities, and societal disparities. And this is what our presenters have highlighted today. There are vulnerable populations in our midst, as described by the speakers. They're migrants, migrant farm workers, refugees, the poor, migrant children, victims of trafficking, victims of war, just to mention a few. The COVID-19 pandemic has placed all the issues related to these populations in the spotlight and has forced us to examine the stark realities of our interconnectedness, our humanity, and the need to protect the most vulnerable among us. Using the example of migrant workers that Isabella talked about and that we discussed earlier, migrant workers from Africa undertake perilous journeys to work in Europe and other countries. They pick vegetables and fruits. They live in overcrowded tent camps and shantytowns as described by previously. There's no access to potable water and electricity is not available. So my question is, how can they practice social distancing? So their vulnerability to COVID-19 is exacerbated. So a picture is worth 1,000 words. So just to see the conditions in which they are. They work for long periods, almost 12 to 18 hours a day for under €2. These are the conditions in which they find themselves. And so, and as Trevor talked about, we have folks in refugee camps in many places, sleeping close to each other. Again, how can they practice social distances? In many cases, they move according to the needs of the harvest. The food supply in most countries is dependent on the workers. They are part of the industrial global food system that remains invisible to us, the consumers. We have not paid enough attention to the human rights of the agricultural workers who cook our food daily. Migrant workers and refugees become targets of xenophobia, discrimination, and human rights abuse. These human rights abuses are severe, especially those that violate the rights for adequate nutrition, housing, and good working conditions. Now, since COVID-19, fruits and vegetables are withering on the vine due to the national lockdown, and we have realized the strategic needs of migrant workers for fresh food and food security. So what can we do as we move forward? We need to have dignified living conditions for farm workers, refugees, and displaced populations. We have to ask ourselves the question, why are there economic refugees? Why do they leave their countries on such a perilous journey as described by Isabella to work in unseemly conditions? What are some of the things that we can do that has shown the cracks and fissures in our society, as showed by the COVID-19 pandemic? It highlights the need for economic security, job development, potable waters, a living wage, and security for all people. We have to recognize the significance of marginalized population in our food security. We need to advocate for change for food workers and to amplify our voice in the global food economy. We must address the disparities in health so that no population dies unnecessarily due to comorbidities or poor access to health care. And we need to advocate for changes in disparities in our social framework. And we need to advocate for accessible health care for all, including the undocumented. And we must advocate for change for all vulnerable populations. We must build a culture of respect for all people so no one is marginalized, stigmatized, discriminated against, or placed in an underground economy. And to quote one of the directors from Human Rights Watch, we fear what will happen as COVID-19 ravages the continent of Africa with weak public health and healthcare systems, and in part due to the difficulty of isolating people in densely populated urban and displacement camps. So, as Isabella said, are we all in this together?
Thank you very much. Is that it, Stephanie?
Yes, I'm done. I said thank you.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you very much. And also, I want to repeat thanking Maura Trail and Lily for their support behind the scenes. And just close it here. It's been 6 weeks. It's about 6 weeks now, not more, that we've been talking about the impending doom and disaster on the continent of Africa. It really has not materialized. And there is ample time and ample opportunity for it to happen. It hasn't happened in the way that we feared. It may still happen, but I think there is something that we need to look at about the continent and see, what are they doing? What is happening? How is it that they have been able to keep it at arm's length? 1.3 billion people, 20,000 people infected, about less than 2,000 people having passed away. They're telling us something. Africa is telling us something. We need to take a look at it. And we will look at that in the future. Anyway, I want to thank everyone for participating in this webinar, and my colleagues, the speakers, and the panelists as well. Until next time, our next panel will be in 2 weeks' time, the 2 Thursdays from now. And you will get our email again, and we hope to see you then. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And
Bye-bye.
all the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Yang Cho.
Mm-hmm.